Dr. Silas Pembroke slammed his black bag onto the Bellamy kitchen table so hard the coffee cups rattled, and he pointed one thick finger directly at Elowen Mercer's face. "You have 30 seconds to leave this house," he said, "before I have you removed." Nora Bellamy lay burning on the cot behind him, 12 years old and barely conscious, her breathing shallow and her skin the color of candle wax. Elowen had not yet touched the child. She had simply walked through the door. That was enough for Pembroke. That was always enough for Pembroke. "The girl needs," Elowen began. "The girl needs a physician," Pembroke said. "Not a ranch woman who reads pamphlets and plays at medicine." Elowen's hands went still at her sides. She had heard versions of that sentence for 6 years. It never stopped landing like a fist. If you believe a woman who fights back is worth watching, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will surprise you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had started 3 days before Everett Calder ever saw the light from Elowen Mercer's ranch. He was not a man who complained about weather. 36 years old, 12 of them spent riding the territories as a federal marshal, and he had learned early that complaining about rain was about as useful as arguing with a mule. You endured it. You kept moving. You got to where you were supposed to be. That was the philosophy. The philosophy stopped working somewhere in the middle of the Bitter Glass Mountains when the trail turned into a river and Copper went down. He felt it before he heard it, a horrible sideways lurch, a sound like something snapping inside wet wood, and then 400 pounds of horse scrambling on loose rock while Everett threw himself clear to avoid being pinned. He landed hard on his left shoulder, rolled, came up in mud to his elbows, and turned around to find Copper standing on 3 legs at the edge of the trail. "Easy," Everett said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Easy, boy. Don't move." Copper didn't move. The stallion stood with his right foreleg held up off the ground, trembling in the rain, his dark eyes showing white at the edges. Everett had owned that horse for 9 years. He knew what fear looked like on him. This was fear. He worked his way over slowly, talking the whole time nothing important, just words to fill the sound of the rain and the thunder rolling around in the mountains above them. He ran his hands down the injured leg, feeling for the break he dreaded. Nothing gave under his fingers. No grinding, no displacement. That was something. Not a fracture, maybe. But the leg was wrong all the same. The ankle joint was hot and swelling already, and when Everett carefully pressed along the lower tendon, Copper flinched and pulled away. "All right," Everett muttered. "All right, I hear you." The light was going. In the mountains in Montana in October, when the light went, it went fast, and the temperature went with it. Everett straightened up, wiped the mud off his hands onto his coat pointlessly, since the coat was already soaked through, and looked around at nothing useful. Trees, rock, the trail disappearing into mud in both directions. The nearest settlement, Red Hollow, was at least 14 miles east, and that was assuming the low crossing below the ridge was still passable, which, given the amount of water currently running down every surface he could see, he doubted. He could not ride Copper. He could barely ask the horse to walk. He could not leave Copper. Aside from the fact that the horse would not survive the night alone, and injured in this weather, Everett Calder did not leave things he was responsible for. That was another philosophy. That one had never failed him. So he stood in the rain on a ruined trail in the dark and did the only thing available to him. He looked for a light. It took 20 minutes of leading Copper at a pace slow enough to be almost insulting before he saw it a warm yellow glow through the trees, maybe a quarter-mile off the trail, down a slope that was going to be miserable to navigate with a 3-legged horse. Everett looked at the light. He looked at Copper. He looked at the darkness closing in around them. "Don't fall," he told the horse. Then he started down the slope. He fell twice. Copper didn't fall at all, which meant the horse had more sense than he did, or at least better footing. By the time they reached level ground, and Everett could see the shape of the buildings, a house, a barn, fencing, the outlines of a working ranch, he was covered in mud from his boots to his collar and had bitten through the inside of his cheek when he hit the ground the second time. He could taste blood and rain, and he was very cold, and he was done being philosophical about any of it. He knocked on the door of the house. Nothing happened. He knocked knocked again louder. A voice came from behind him, from the direction of the barn, and it was not a welcoming voice. "I've got a rifle, and I'm not guessing at shadows. Step into the light and state your business." Everett turned around slowly, hands away from his coat. A lantern moved toward him from the barn doorway, and behind the lantern was a woman. She was younger than he'd expected from the voice, late 20s, maybe with dark hair plastered flat by the rain, and a Winchester held in both hands with the kind of casual confidence that told him she knew how to use it and wasn't frightened. "Federal Marshal," he said. Everett called her. "My horse is hurt. I need shelter for the night." The lantern came closer. She looked at him the way someone looks at an unexpected bill, not panicked, just calculating whether she has the resources to deal with it. Then the light swung past him to copper, and something in her face changed. "How long has he been holding that leg up?" she said. "About an hour." She handed Everett the lantern, just handed it to him without explanation, and walked past him toward copper. Everett turned to watch. She approached the horse the same way he had, slowly talking, giving Copper time to recognize her as something other than a threat. Then she ran her hands down the injured leg with a sureness that surprised him. She pressed, she flexed. Copper pinned his ears but didn't pull away. "Suspensory ligament," she said. "Maybe the fetlock joint. Not broken, but he's going to need rest." "How long?" She looked up at him. "Depends. 2 weeks minimum if nothing's torn. Could be 4. Everett looked at the sky, which was still pouring rain, and then at the trail he'd come down, which he couldn't even see from here anymore. "I see," he said. "Do you?" the woman said. It wasn't quite a question. "Everett called her," he said again, because it seemed like the right thing to say. "I heard you the first time." She stood up and wiped her hands on her trousers. "Elowen Mercer, bring him to the barn." Inside the barn it was dry, and it smelled like hay and horses and the particular warmth that livestock generate in cold weather, which is one of the more honest smells in the world. Elowen Mercer put Copper in a stall with clean bedding and went to work with the efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times, which Everett was beginning to understand she probably had. She packed the leg with something from a clay pot that smelled of pine and something else he couldn't identify, wrapped it with practiced hands, checked the horse's pulse points. Everett stood in the stall doorway and tried not to be in the way. That was harder than it sounded. He was used to being the person people moved around, not the person doing the moving. "You know medicine," he said. "I know animals," she said, without looking up. "That's not the same thing." She glanced up then, just briefly. "No," she agreed. "It's better." He didn't have an answer for that. He filed it away. An older woman appeared in the barn doorway, small, white-haired, wrapped in a heavy shawl, despite the relative warmth inside. She looked at Everett with the frank assessment of someone who has lived long enough to have stopped being polite about it. "I saw you come in," she said. "Beatrice Mercer. I'm Elowen's aunt." She looked at her niece. "I'll put water on." "He's staying in the barn," Elowen said. "He certainly is not," Beatrice said, with the serenity of someone who has been overruling people for decades. "He's staying in the spare room, and he'll have a hot meal first. He looks like something the creek threw up." Everett decided he liked Beatrice Mercer. He was less certain about her niece. The spare room turned out to be small and cold and perfectly adequate. The hot meal was beans and salt pork and bread that was 2 days old, but tasted like the best thing he'd eaten in a week, which it was. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with him and talked enough for both of them, which suited Everett, who was tired and wet and in no condition to make conversation. Elowen came in from the barn after an hour, washed her hands at the basin, sat down across from him without looking at him, and ate her own food in silence. "Copper," Everett said after a while. "He's settled," Elowen said. "Ate a little. That's a good sign. How long have you been treating animals?" She looked up then, and he realized it was the first time he'd gotten a clear look at her face in decent light. She had gray eyes, the kind of gray that isn't soft, more like weathered stone or winter sky. "Since I was old enough to follow my father around the pasture," she said. "Why?" "Just wondering where you learned the packing technique." That's not something most ranch women know. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a wince, but close. "I worked with a physician for a few years." She picked up her fork. "A long time ago." He could tell she didn't want him to ask more. He asked anyway. "In Red Hollow?" A pause. I passed through Red Hollow 2 months ago, he said, delivering a prisoner. The physician there, Pembroke? Elowen set down her fork. Very carefully. That's right, she said. He mentioned the ranch up on the mountain, Everett said. Didn't mention you by name. He wouldn't, she said. And then she looked at him with those stone-gray eyes and said, what exactly did he say? Everett thought about it. What Pembroke had said, over whiskey at the Red Hollow saloon, was that there was a woman up on the Mercer ranch who fancied herself a healer and had nearly killed a man with her remedies, and that the town had been sensible enough to run her out of practice before she could do more damage. He had said it casually, the way men say things they expect to go unchallenged. Everett had not challenged it. He had not had any reason to at the time. He looked at Elowen Mercer, now her competent hands, the sureness with which she had assessed Copper's injury, the supplies organized in the barn with the precision of someone who takes their work seriously, and he said, carefully, he said you'd retired from medicine. Something in her face told him she knew that wasn't all. Something in his face apparently told her he wasn't going to repeat the rest of it. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something she didn't explain, and then she picked up her fork again. Good night, Marshal Calder, she said. He took the dismissal and went to bed. In the morning, the rain was still coming down. The washed-out crossing he'd been worried about was confirmed at breakfast when Beatrice mentioned, with remarkable cheerfulness for someone delivering bad news, that the creek below the ridge had jumped its banks in the night, and the low road to Red Hollow was under 3 feet of water. Happens every wet season, Beatrice said, pouring coffee. Sometimes for 3 days. Sometimes for 3 weeks. Everett looked out the window at the rain and thought about his schedule, his obligations, the prisoner transport he was supposed to oversee in 11 days. Then he looked down at the coffee cup Beatrice had set in front of him, which was full and hot, and frankly the best thing about his morning. I see, he said. You keep saying that, Elowen said, from across the table, without looking up from her own cup. I'm not sure you do. I see that I'm stuck, he said. Is that clearer? Clearer, she agreed. Also accurate. Beatrice smiled into her coffee. He spent the morning in the barn with Copper, more because he needed somewhere to be than because the horse needed him there. Elowen came in mid-morning to check the wrapping, and they coexisted in the stall with the specific tension of 2 stubborn people who have not yet decided whether to be civil. It's worse than I thought, she said, feeling along the joint with careful fingers. Copper stood quietly, which Everett found slightly insulting, given how much the horse had protested when he'd tried the same thing the night before. How much worse, he said. Not worse in a dangerous way. Worse in a time way. She sat back on her heels. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. Everett did the math in his head and did not like the results. That's I know, she said. I have responsibilities. I understand that. I can't stay here for 6 weeks. She looked up at him. You can stay here, she said, or you can walk 14 miles in the rain on a flooded road with a lame horse. Those are your choices. I'm not making them complicated. He opened his mouth. She looked at him with those stone eyes and waited. He closed his mouth. Fine, he said. Good, she said, and went back to working on Copper's leg. He did not go back inside. He was not a man who could sit in a house doing nothing, and after 20 minutes of standing in the barn doorway, watching the rain, he decided that the fence line on the east side of the property, which he had noticed on the way in, had 2 posts leaning at angles that would not survive winter. He found tools in the barn without asking where they were. He went and fixed the posts. Elowen found him there an hour later. She stood at the fence line and looked at the posts and then at him. He kept working. I didn't ask you to do that, she said. I know. Those are my fences. They're also crooked, he said. Bother you. A pause, she said, finally. Then we agree, he said. She made a sound that might have been, in a different woman, the beginning of a laugh. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn, and Everett kept working, and the rain kept coming down, and the strange arithmetic of that place began its slow accumulation. At dinner, Beatrice asked him about his work, and he told her the version he told civilians enough to be honest, not enough to be interesting. Elowen listened without commenting. After dinner, Beatrice produced a deck of cards, and the 3 of them played a game he didn't know well, and Elowen beat him twice, and Beatrice beat them both. And somewhere in the 3rd hand, Everett realized the knot in his shoulders had loosened without him noticing. He didn't sleep well. The spare room was quiet in a way he wasn't used to, the kind of quiet that has texture wind, and the sound of animals settling in the barn and rain on the roof. He lay awake, thinking about the prisoner transport he was going to miss, and the reports he wasn't going to file, and the crossing that wasn't going to clear, and Elowen Mercer's hands on Copper's leg, so sure of themselves, and what Silas Pembroke had said with such easy confidence over a whiskey glass. He thought about a lot of things. He didn't solve any of them. In the morning, he fixed the barn roof where it was leaking over the empty stall at the far end. Elowen came in, looked at the repair, and said nothing. She disappeared into the treatment room she'd set up in the corner of the barn he'd noticed it the first day. The neat shelves of supplies, the clean workbench, and he could hear her working in there and didn't ask what she was doing. At noon, she came out and handed him half a sandwich. He took it. "Copper's swelling's down," she said. "That's good." "A little," she said. "Don't get excited. It's going to go back up tonight. That's how this works." "You always this encouraging," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "Encouraging gets people in trouble." He ate the sandwich. It was better than it had any right to be. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. "Beatrice," she said. "Where'd you learn to fix a barn roof?" "My father," he said. "He had a farm." "Before," she glanced at him. "Before what?" He thought about how to answer that. "Before a lot of things," he said. She accepted that. He noticed she was good at accepting incomplete answers, probably because she gave them herself. On the fourth day, the rain slowed. Not stopped slowed. The road was still impassable. Everett went out to the north pasture and found a section of stone wall that had collapsed and spent 3 hours resetting it. His back was making its opinion known by the time he finished, but the wall was solid, and there was a satisfaction in that which he hadn't expected to feel. Elowen came out with coffee. Actual coffee in an actual cup, carried across a wet field. He took it without comment. She looked at the wall. "That's better than it was," she said. "It was half fallen," he said. "Father built that wall," she said, "before he died. He looked at the wall differently then." "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have asked." She shook her head. "It was falling," she said. "He would have wanted it fixed." She paused. He fixed things too. Couldn't sit still. She looked at Everett when she said it, with the slightest emphasis on the last word, and he had the odd sensation of being understood by someone who wasn't trying to understand him. Coffee was strong. He drank it and looked at her father's wall, and she stood beside him and didn't say anything else. And the rain was light enough now that it wasn't unpleasant, just damp, and Everett had the strange and disorienting sensation that he was not in a hurry to go back inside. That was new. That was the kind of new that you notice, because it feels like something shifting in the ground under your feet. Not alarming, exactly, but not something to ignore. On the 6th day, the road was still under water, but the rain had stopped entirely, and Elowen mentioned, without looking at him, that the stands of yarrow on the upper slope were probably worth harvesting before the deer found them, and that she could use the help reaching them, because the path was steep and she would need someone to carry the basket. Everett said that he supposed he could do that. They spent 2 hours on the mountain. Elowen cut the yarrow with quick, precise movements and told him what she used it for: fever, bleeding, inflammation, and he found himself actually listening, not just waiting for a gap to say something. She knew things he didn't know. He was not a man who was easily interested, but he was interested in this. "You could practice in Red Hollow again," he said, on the way down. Pembroke, "No," she said. Flat and final, he let it rest. "You could practice somewhere else, Missoula." "Helena could," she said, but she was quiet for a moment. "My aunt is here. The ranch is here." She looked at the valley below them. "What I'm building is here. What are you building?" She looked at him sideways. "Something that doesn't need their permission," she said. He turned that over in his mind for the rest of the way down. Something that doesn't need their permission. He had spent 12 years operating under the weight of law, of authority structures, of the approval of men who sat in offices he'd never seen. He understood wanting to be free of that. He understood it in a way he hadn't expected to. That night at dinner, Beatrice told a story about Elowen at age 12 trying to set a neighbor's broken chicken wing, the chicken, not the neighbor, and making it worse, and then making it right, and finally succeeding after 3 days of what Beatrice called pure pig-headed determination. Elowen told her aunt to stop. Beatrice kept going. Everett laughed for the first time since he'd arrived, and the sound surprised all three of them. Elowen looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not warm exactly, but not what it had been a week ago either. On the 8th day, Copper stood flat on all 4 hooves for 20 minutes without favoring the injured leg. Elowen watched from outside the stall, and Everett watched her watch his horse. And he said, "He's getting better." "He's getting better," she confirmed. "Good," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "I'll leave when he's sound," Everett said. He'd said some version of this every day. It was becoming a kind of ritual, a reminder to himself, or to her, or to both of them. He wasn't entirely sure anymore. Elowen reached up and checked the stall latch, which didn't need checking. "Then I hope he heals very slowly," she said. She said it lightly. Lightly enough that you could take it as a joke. Everett looked at her. She was looking at the horse, but her jaw had done something tightened. Just briefly, in the way jaws do when someone is keeping their face neutral on purpose. He knew that expression. He made it himself, frequently. "Elowen," he said. "Get some sleep, Marshal," she said. "He'll need a new wrap in the morning." She left the barn. Everett stood in the dark with his horse and the lantern and the smell of pine medicine and hay, and tried to remember the last time he had been somewhere long enough to want to stay. He couldn't. He fed Copper a handful of oats from his pocket, because the horse had earned them, and because doing something practical was better than standing there, failing to solve the problem of how it was possible to feel, after only 9 days, that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. Outside, the sky had cleared. Stars showed through the gaps in the clouds, the first stars he'd seen since arriving. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at them for a while, and did not think about schedules or prisoner transports or the road to Red Hollow. He thought about Yarrow on a mountain slope and stone walls and coffee carried across a wet field. He thought about gray eyes that looked at him like they were making a decision. Then he went inside and went to bed because tomorrow the horse would need a new wrap, and there was still a section of fence on the south side that was bothering him, and that was enough to have in front of you. It was more than enough. He was beginning to understand exactly the right amount. The south fence section that had been bothering Everett took 2 full days to fix properly. The posts weren't just leaning, 3 of them had rotted at the base, which meant pulling them out entirely and resetting new ones, and the new ones had to be cut from timber in the wood pile, which Everett did himself with Elowen's hatchet and a handsaw he found hanging in the barn. It was not elegant work. His hands blistered on the 2nd day, and he went through 2 sets of work gloves, and the saw got stuck twice in the green wood, and he said things he would not have said in front of Beatrice. But by the end of the 2nd afternoon, the fence was standing straight and solid, and was going to stay that way through winter, which was the point. Elowen came out to look at it. She had a habit of doing that, appearing without announcement to assess what he'd done, the way a foreman checks a hired hand's work, though she never said anything critical. She walked the fence line, pressed a post with her palm, stepped back. "You cut the posts yourself," she said. "The ones in the woodpile were too short." "I know. I've been meaning to get longer ones from the mill in Red Hollow for 2 years. "Well," he said, "now you don't need to." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She said it like a woman who doesn't say it often, which meant when she said it, she meant it. Everett nodded and didn't make more of it than it was. But he thought about it later, in the spare room, listening to the wind that had come back in off the mountains. 2 years. She had been meaning to do it for 2 years. That was a lot of things to mean to do, the kind of accumulation that happens when one person is managing too much land with not enough hands. He'd seen the same look on his father's face in the last years of the farm, that particular tiredness that isn't about sleep, that's about the arithmetic of the work never quite adding up no matter what you do. He went out the next morning and looked at the barn properly, not just the roof he'd patched. The north wall had a gap where 2 boards had warped apart. The hinge on the main door was working on borrowed time. The water trough in the yard had a slow leak he'd noticed on day 2 and kept meaning to mention. He found pitch in the barn stores, repaired the trough, rehung the door hinge with better hardware from a tin in the back of the tack room, and was partway through the barn wall when Elowen appeared in the doorway with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite something else. "You're fixing things again," she said. I noticed. You can't just fix things, she said. This is my property. Everett pushed a new board into place and held it. Hand me those nails, he said. A pause. Then she crossed the barn and picked up the tin of nails and held it out to him. He took one. She stayed where she was. I don't need charity, she said. It's not charity, he said. I'm staying here for free. Eating your food, using your barn for my horse. I need to do something or I go crazy. She considered that. You could read, she said. Beatrice has books. I've read Beatrice's books, he said, both of them. She made a sound. It was not quite a laugh, but it occupied the same general territory. There are 3, she said. The third one I couldn't get past the first chapter, he said. I tried twice. She sat down on a hay bale, just sat there, which surprised him because she was not a person he associated with sitting. He kept working and let the silence be what it was. Tell me what Pembroke actually said, she said. When you were in Red Hollow. Everett set the board. Picked up another nail. He said you'd retired from medicine. You told me that already. What else? He drove the nail before he answered. He said you'd treated a man incorrectly, that the town had lost confidence in your judgment. She was quiet. He said it very casually, Everett added. The way people say things they've said so many times they've stopped thinking about them. He's had 6 years to practice, she said. Everett put down the hammer, turned around. She was looking at the barn floor, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen before, not grief exactly, more like the residue of grief. The expression left after the sharp part has faded, and what remains is just the fact of it. What happened? He said. She looked up. What makes you think I want to tell you? Nothing, he said. You don't have to. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the floor. I worked with Pembroke for 3 years. I wasn't a physician, he was clear about that. Very clear. I was his assistant. I mixed medicines, I kept records, I helped with minor cases when he was occupied. She paused. Good at it. Better than he wanted me to be, I think. He didn't say that, but I think it. Everett waited. There was a man, she said. A rancher named Coulter. He came in with a chest infection that had been going for 2 weeks. Pembroke prescribed a specific dosage of something I don't need to explain the chemistry of it. The dosage was wrong. Too high for a man Coulter's size, with a heart that was already strained. She pressed her palms together. I told Pembroke. Quietly. In private. I told him I thought the dose was wrong. What did he say? He said I was mistaken. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if she had been angry. So I prepared the medicine the way he prescribed, because he was the physician and I was the assistant, and that was how it worked. She stopped. Coulter nearly died. His heart was damaged. He recovered, but not fully. Everett said nothing. Pembroke told the town I had prepared the medicine incorrectly, she said, that I had miscalculated the dosage against his instructions, that he had trusted me and I had made a dangerous error. She paused. By the time I understood what was happening, it was done. His version was the only one people had heard, and people in Red Hollow had known Silas Pembroke for 20 years. They had known me for 3. You didn't fight it, Everett said. It was not an accusation. He was just asking. I fought it for 4 months, she said. I went to the town council. I wrote a statement. I found 2 other cases where I thought his decisions were questionable, and I documented them. She looked up at him. Do you know what happened? They believed him, Everett said. They believed him, she said. And then they told me I was lucky he hadn't pursued criminal charges for endangering a patient and suggested that I leave quietly before things became more unpleasant. She stood up. So I did. I came back to the ranch, and I started over, and I decided I was done asking permission from people who had already made up their minds. She crossed the barn toward the door, and Everett said, That's why you won't go back to Red Hollow. I go to Red Hollow, she said, pausing in the doorway. I buy supplies there. I sell eggs there. She looked at him over her shoulder. I just don't ask it for anything anymore. She left. Everett stood in the barn with a hammer in his hand and thought about Silas Pembroke sitting in the Red Hollow saloon, comfortable and certain, telling a stranger about a ranch woman who fancied herself a healer. He thought about the ease of it, the way a lie becomes a fact when enough time passes and no one challenges it. He picked up the hammer and went back to work, and the anger that settled in him was quiet and thorough, and he didn't do anything with it, because there was nothing to do with it yet. Copper was improving. That was undeniable now. and not just to Everett. Even Beatrice had taken to visiting the stall in the mornings, bringing an apple she'd cut in quarters, standing there with her shawl around her shoulders, while the horse ate from her palm with that particular delicacy that large animals sometimes have, the careful lips, the breath warm against old skin. "He's a good horse," Beatrice told Everett one morning. "He is," Everett said. Elowen said the same thing. "Last night when she thought I was asleep, Beatrice fed Copper another apple quarter. She also said you set fence posts better than any man she's hired." "She hired men to fix the fence?" "Once. They charged her twice what they were worth and left one section crooked." Beatrice looked at him sideways. "She fixed that section herself, in the snow." Everett looked at the horse. "She doesn't talk about herself much," Beatrice said, "in case you hadn't noticed." "I noticed." "She's told you about Pembroke, though." "It wasn't a question. I can tell. She has a certain look when she's deciding whether she regrets saying something." Everett said, "She seemed like she needed to say it." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "She did," she said. "She's been keeping that particular piece of herself very still for a long time." She handed Copper the last apple piece. Don't mistake being told something for being trusted. With Elowen, they happen separately. The telling comes first. The trust is slower. He thought about that for a long time. The days developed a pattern that he hadn't designed and didn't entirely understand, the kind of pattern that happens when two people stop negotiating every small decision and start moving around each other by instinct instead. Everett was up, before anyone else, started the stove, checked Copper before breakfast. Elowen came to the barn mid-morning, and he stayed out of her way while she worked. After noon, they were generally in the same part of the property without having arranged to be, and sometimes that meant working in parallel silence, and sometimes it meant talking, and the difference between the two stopped feeling significant somewhere around the 11th day. She asked him about his father's farm on the 12th day. They were in the kitchen. She was cataloging her herb stores, and he was fixing a cupboard hinge that had been driving him quietly insane since day 3. And she said, without looking up, "You said before." Before a lot of things. He looked at her. "Your father's farm," she said. "You said you learned to fix roofs before a lot of things." "I've been wondering what the things were." He fitted the hinge pin. "My father died when I was 19. The farm went to debt after. I went a different direction. The law, he said. "Eventually. Some other directions first." "What kind of other directions?" "The kind a 19-year-old goes when he's angry and doesn't have the sense to be careful about it," he said. "Nothing worth repeating." She looked up then. "That's very vague." "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment, and he had the sense again of being measured, but not unkindly, and not in the way people usually measured a marshal, which was as an authority, a potential problem, a symbol. She was measuring him like she would measure a patient, looking for where it actually hurt. "You became a marshal because of the law," she said, "or because of something the law could fix." He set down the hinge pin. "My father's farm didn't go to debt because of bad luck," he said. A banker in Billings called in his notes early, against the terms of the loan. My father didn't know enough to fight it. By the time he understood what had happened, he was already done. He picked up the pin again. "The banker is still in Billings. The law couldn't do anything about it then. It still can't. So why the law? Because at least it's something," he said. "Against nothing, something is enough." She was quiet. Then she said, "That's the most you've said at one time since you got here." "You asked the right questions," he said. She looked back at her herb jars. He put the hinge on the cupboard. It swung clean and smooth. He closed it, opened it, closed it again. And the satisfaction of that was out of proportion to the thing itself, the way small things become significant when you are somewhere that is starting to matter. On the 14th day, Everett wrote a letter to his deputy, Holt, explaining the situation, the injury, the road, the delay, and gave it to a passing freighter who came by the road below the ranch on his way to Red Hollow. The freighter took the letter and gave him the news from town in return, as freighters do, the informal postal system of the territory. There had been illness going around. A child had been taken with fever 3 days back. Pembroke was treating her. Everett mentioned this to Elowen at dinner. She set down her fork. "Which child?" she said. He didn't say. "Bellamy family," he thought. "A daughter." Something went across Elowen's face that she controlled very quickly. Bellamy's have a daughter named Nora, she said. She's 12. She picked up her fork. Pembroke will manage. You know the family? Everett said. They've bought eggs from us. Nora comes sometimes with her mother. She was eating again, but not tasting anything. He could tell by the mechanical quality of the movement. She's a healthy girl. She'll be fine. The freighter said it had been going on a few days, Everett said. Elowen said nothing. Beatrice poured more coffee for everyone and changed the subject, and they talked about other things. And the evening passed the way. Evenings had been passing, with cards and quietness and the fire burning low, but Elowen was not entirely in the room for the rest of it. Part of her was somewhere he couldn't follow. On the 15th day, Copper placed his full weight on the injured leg for the first time. It happened in the morning, without drama. Everett was cleaning out the stall, and Copper simply put the foot down and stood on it, square and solid, and Everett stopped what he was doing and watched. And then Elowen appeared at the stall door and watched too, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He's putting weight on it, Everett said. Yes, she said. That's progress. It's the beginning of progress, she said. Don't get ahead of it. But she was watching the horse with an expression that was as close to satisfied as he'd seen from her, and he noticed she left her hand resting on the stall door a moment longer than necessary before she went to the supply shelf, as though she needed to stay in contact with something solid. That afternoon, he helped her carry supplies up to the higher pasture where she kept 2 goats and a lame mule she'd taken in from a neighbor. The mule was a mean-tempered animal named Hector who did not appreciate being helped, a quality Everett found oddly relatable. The path was steep and rocky, and they went slowly, and partway up Elowen said, without any particular lead-in, Pembroke was right about one thing. Everett waited. I wasn't a physician, she said. I was never trained as one. What I knew I learned watching and reading and paying attention, and that's real. I believe it's real, but it has limits. She shifted the supply basket on her arm. I know those limits better than he does. That's the part he got wrong. What are your limits? Everett said. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. I can diagnose what I can see and touch and smell. I can treat infection, manage pain, set simple fractures. I understand how medicines interact well enough to be careful about it. She paused. What I can't do is what requires a surgeon, what requires equipment I don't have, what requires training I haven't had. She looked at him. Pembroke's mistake was believing he had no limits at all. That's more dangerous than mine. A man who knows what he doesn't know, Everett said, is safer than a man who thinks he knows everything. Yes, she said. Exactly that. Hector tried to bite Everett when they arrived. Everett stepped back in time, and Elowen said he does that, with a tone that suggested she found this slightly funny. You could have mentioned it, Everett said. I thought you'd figure it out, she said. Before or after he got me. I wasn't sure which, she said. I wanted to see. He looked at her. She was very carefully not smiling. He picked up the feed bucket and gave Hector a wide berth, and thought that there were worse things than being tested by a woman who kept a mean mule and watched to see how you handled it. On the way back down, she said, What will you do when you leave? Go back to work, he said. And after that, more work, he said. She nodded slowly. Do you have a place? Somewhere that's yours. Rented rooms in 3 different towns, he said, depending on which part of the territory I'm assigned. That's not a place, she said. No, he said, it's not. She said nothing more about it, but he felt the conversation's weight settle on him in a way that stayed there, pressing against something he didn't usually press on. That night, he sat on the porch steps for a while before coming in. Sky was the particular blue-black of high country nights, deep and very clear, and he could see the mountain ridges against it. He had been in this valley for 2 weeks and 3 days, and somewhere in those days, something had shifted that he had not budgeted for and could not entirely name. Beatrice came out and sat beside him. She didn't say why. After a while, she said, she fixed this porch herself. After her father died. She was 22. She worked on it for a week in August, and her hands bled on the 3rd day, and she just wrapped them up and kept going. Everett looked at the porch planks. Why are you telling me that? He said. Because you're a man who needs to understand what he's looking at, Beatrice said, before he decides what to do about it. He thought about that for a long time after she went inside. On the 17th day, a woman came to the ranch with a dog that had been gored by a fence wire. She had come from 3 miles away, following, she said, advice from her neighbor, who had heard from someone else that there was a woman at the Mercer Ranch who could help with animals when the situation wasn't something you could wait on. She stood in the yard with the wrapped dog in her arms, uncertain, looking at Elowen the way people look when they've been told something might help, but they're not sure they believe it yet. Elowen took the dog. Everett watched from the fence while she worked at the barn bench, efficient and calm, cleaning the wound and closing it and speaking to the woman the entire time, explaining what she was doing and why. And the woman went from uncertain to attentive, to by the end simply grateful in the straightforward way of someone whose problem has been solved. She left with the dog wrapped and sedated, and a packet of supplies and instructions written in Elowen's clean, spare handwriting. When the woman's wagon had gone down the road, Everett crossed the yard. "That's not the first time someone's come here," he said. Elowen was cleaning the bench. "No," she said. "How often?" "Not often. A few times a month. Word travels slowly." She rinsed the cloth. "Slowly is fine. You don't charge them," he said. He had been watching. No money had changed hands. She looked at him. "Most of them can't afford to pay much. Some of them can't afford to pay anything." She wrung out the cloth. "I charge what they can give. Sometimes that's nothing. Sometimes it's a basket of eggs or a pound of butter." "You can't run a practice on eggs and butter," he said. "I'm not running a practice," she said. "I'm building something else." She put the cloth away. "I told you. Something that doesn't need their permission." He understood it differently now than he had the first time she'd said it. The first time he'd heard defiance. Now he heard something more deliberate than that. She was not building against Red Hollow. She was building around it, the way water finds a different channel when the direct route is blocked. On the 18th day, Elowen woke at 4 in the morning because Copper was restless. Everett heard the horse, too, was on his feet and in his boots before he was fully awake. The habit of years, and got to the barn a minute before she did. Copper was fine. He had simply knocked over his water bucket and was unhappy about the dampness in his bedding. They established this together in about 2 minutes, after which they stood on opposite sides of the stall door in the lamplight, both slightly ridiculous in their urgency over nothing. And Elowen said, "He's manipulative, with the conviction of a woman who has been fooled before." "He does this at home too," Everett admitted. "Gets lonely." "He's a horse." "He's my horse," Everett said. "There's a difference." She refilled the bucket. He reset the bedding. They worked around each other without discussing who was doing what, and when it was done, they stood in the barn in the 4 o'clock quiet, and Elowen said, "Without any warning, I don't usually tell people about Pembroke." "I know," he said. "I told you because she stopped." He waited. "I'm not entirely sure why," she said. "That bothers me a little." "It doesn't have to mean anything," he said carefully. She looked at him. "No," she said, "but it might." She left the barn, taking the lamp. He stood in the dark with his horse for a minute, listening to Copper breathe, and thought that there were certain things you didn't say out loud, because saying them made them too real to manage carefully, and that Elowen Mercer was a woman who understood that, who lived by it, and that she had just said something out loud anyway. That was not nothing. On the 20th day, the freighter came back through on his return route and stopped at the gate. Everett was in the yard and went to meet him. The news from Red Hollow was not good. Bellamy girl Nora was worse. The fever hadn't broken. Pembroke had tried 2 treatments, and neither had worked. The family was frightened. Half the town was frightened, because frightened spreads faster than fever in a small settlement, and there was talk of sending for a physician from Missoula, but that would take 4 days each way, and the roads were bad. Everett thanked the freighter and stood in the yard for a moment, and then he went to find Elowen. She was in the treatment room. She listened to him without interrupting, her hands still on the workbench, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. "Pembroke has resources I don't have," she said. "He doesn't seem to be using them effectively," Everett said. She looked at her hands. "If I go into Red Hollow," she said slowly, "and something goes wrong." "Something is already going wrong," Everett said. "That's the news." She pressed her hands flat on the bench. He could see her working through it, the calculation not of her own risk. He understood by now that her own risk was not the primary variable, but of Nora Bellamy's odds. What she knew. what Pembroke might have missed. Whether knowing something and not acting on it was a choice she could live with. Beatrice should stay, she said. The animals need. I'll go with you, Everett said. She looked up. I'm the marshal, he said. You're accompanying me on a welfare check in the settlement. If anyone has a problem with that framing, they can take it up with the badge. Elowen was quiet for a moment. That's not what a welfare check is, she said. It's close enough, he said. Are you going to argue the legal terminology, or are we going? She stood up, started gathering supplies from the shelves, her movements quick and precise, the particular economy of motion that meant she had made a decision and was not revisiting it. She packed the way someone packs who has thought about what they might need before they knew they needed it, which was Everett was learning, how Elowen Mercer did most things. He's going to tell me to leave, she said, pushing a roll of clean linen into the bag. Yes, Everett said. Are you going to let him? He thought of Silas Pembroke at the saloon, easy and certain, speaking about a woman who wasn't there to answer. He thought of Elowen, fixing her father's wall in the snow and wrapping her hands and keeping going. That, Everett said, is going to depend on what he does next. They rode to Red Hollow in the early afternoon, Elowen on her gray mare and Everett on Copper, who was moving well enough now for a careful ride on flat ground, his gait slightly cautious but sound. The supply bag was tied behind Elowen's saddle. Neither of them talked much on the road. The mountains were behind them, and the valley opened out ahead, the settlement visible after an hour's riding as a cluster of buildings along a flat stretch of creek, a general store, a church, a saloon, a livery, a physician's office at the far end of the main street, with its painted shingle hanging above the door. Elowen did not look at the shingle when they rode past it. Everett noticed. The Bellamy farm was a mile south of town, a modest operation with a good barn and a farmhouse that had been added onto twice, the additions visible in the different shades of weathered wood. A wagon was outside. 2 horses were tied at the post, which meant visitors, which meant the news had traveled the way. News travels in small places fast and without asking permission. They dismounted. Elowen tied her mare without hesitation, straightened her coat, picked up the supply bag, and walked to the door. Everett came behind her, 1 step back, which was deliberate. This was her call to make. He was here because 14 miles on bad roads was safer with 2 people, because his badge was occasionally useful, and because he had discovered that he was not capable of letting her walk into this alone without it sitting wrong in him all the way back to the ranch. He had not examined that feeling closely. He was not sure he was ready to. Ruth Bellamy answered the door. She was a woman in her mid-30s with the particular look of someone who has not slept in 3 days, not dramatic exhaustion, just the specific flatness behind the eyes that comes from fear sustained too long. She looked at Elowen, and something moved in her face that was complicated, not quite relief, not quite hesitation, something between the two. Miss Mercer, she said. Mrs. Bellamy, Elowen said. I heard about Nora. I came to see if I could help. Ruth Bellamy looked past Elowen at Everett. Marshal Calder, he said. I'm passing through. Miss Mercer was kind enough to accompany me. It was not precisely the truth. It was not precisely a lie. Ruth Bellamy looked at his badge, the way civilians look at badges when they're frightened and tired and running low on options, which is to say with something very close to gratitude, and she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. The farmhouse interior was warm and smelled of onions and medicine, and the particular close smell of illness. 3 women from town were in the main room. Everett recognized the type, if not the faces. The women who appear in a crisis, with covered dishes and well-meaning presence and nowhere better to be. They looked at Elowen the way some people look at a complication they haven't accounted for. Tom Bellamy was at the kitchen table, a large, quiet man whose hands were wrapped around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. He looked up when they came in, and his face did the same complicated thing his wife's had done. We appreciate you coming, he said. To Elowen, and the effort it cost him to say it simply and mean it was visible to anyone paying attention. Pembroke came out of the back room before Elowen could answer. He stopped when he saw her. Silas Pembroke was 61 years old, silver-haired, well-dressed even in the Bellamy farmhouse, carrying the kind of settled authority that comes from being the most educated person in a room for so long you've stopped noticing you rely on it. He had a physician's bag in one hand and a look on his face that went through several calculations very quickly before arriving at something controlled and cold. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, without taking his eyes off Elowen. "I wasn't aware you'd sent for additional consultation." "I didn't," Ruth said. "Miss Mercer came on her own." "Miss Mercer," Pembroke said, and the way he said it managed to suggest, without any individual word you could point to, that the title was generous, "is not a physician. I've examined Nora thoroughly. The situation is being managed." "The freighter said the fever hasn't broken," Elowen said. Her voice was level. Everett had been watching her hands, which were the part of her that was less controlled, and they were tight on the bag strap. "Fevers take time," Pembroke said. "That's medicine. It is not always immediate." "How many days?" Elowen said. "That is not your concern." "How many days, Dr. Pembroke?" Not a question the second time. A muscle moved in Pembroke's jaw. 4 days, he said. The room was quiet. 4 days was a long time for a fever in a 12-year-old. Everyone in that room knew it, including Pembroke, and the fact that he had said it without flinching told Everett something about how Pembroke had survived this long by saying difficult things as though they were unremarkable. Elowen said, "I'd like to see her." "That," Pembroke said, "is not going to happen." He set his bag down on the table, a deliberate move establishing territory. "You have no standing here. You have no credentials. You have no right to involve yourself in my patient's care, and I will not permit you to upset this family further with whatever you imagine you can offer." He was looking at Elowen when he said it, but the last part was aimed at the room, at Ruth Bellamy, at the women from town, at Tom Bellamy's large, quiet hands around the coffee cup. It was a speech designed to close a door before anyone thought to open it. Everett's hand moved to his coat where the badge was pinned. Elowen said, "Don't." He stopped. She didn't look at him when she said it, but she meant him, and she meant all of it, the badge. The authority, the instinct to step in front. She had known he would do it before he'd done it, and she was telling him no with a single word and trusting him to understand why. He understood why. She took a breath and she looked at Ruth Bellamy, not at Pembroke. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "I'm not here to take over. I'm not here to argue with Dr. Pembroke. I'm here because Nora knows me, and because I know some things about wound infection." That she paused, very briefly, choosing the word, "that might be useful to look at again. That's all." She held the woman's gaze. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But the decision should be yours, not his." The room went absolutely still. Pembroke said, "Ruth, quiet," Tom Bellamy said. Just that. Quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way a man says something when he has been sitting for 3 days watching his daughter burn and has run out of patience for everything except the possibility of his daughter not burning anymore. Pembroke went quiet. Ruth Bellamy looked at Elowen for a long moment. She was not a stupid woman. She was a frightened woman, which is different, and frightened women sometimes make very clear decisions when the alternative is made plain enough. "Come back and see her," Ruth said. Pembroke picked up his bag. "If you walk out of this house," Everett said, and it was the first thing he'd said since introducing himself at the door, "that's your choice, doctor. But I'd suggest you stay." His voice was not loud. It was the voice he used when he wanted someone to understand that he was not making a suggestion. Pembroke stayed. The back room was small, with a narrow cot against the wall and a window that let in the flat afternoon light. Nora Bellamy was small for 12, which Everett thought was probably not her natural size, but the way illness makes children look diminished. Temporary, like something that has been reduced by a process not yet finished. Her hair was damp against the pillow, and her cheeks had that hectic color that is not the color of health. She was conscious. That was something. She turned her head when they came in, and when she saw Elowen, her face did something small and involuntary. Not quite a smile. More like the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right person and didn't know they were waiting. "Miss Elowen," she said. Her voice was rough. "Hey, sweetheart," Elowen said, and sat beside the cot, and took Nora's hand in both of hers with a naturalness that told Everett this was not the first time they had been in the same room. The egg sales, he thought, the mother and daughter who had come to the ranch. He had not put that together until now. "I don't feel good," Nora said. "I know," Elowen said. "I'm going to look at you, if that's all right." Nora nodded. Elowen worked quickly and carefully, asking questions in a low voice, her hands moving over the girl's neck, her arms, her sides. She lifted the blanket and checked the girl's legs. And there the left leg. Below the knee there was a bandage already in place. Pembroke's work, covering what he had identified as the original injury, a gash from a fence wire 5 days ago. Elowen looked at the bandage. She looked at the leg. She pressed gently above and below the bandage, watching Nora's face. Nora winced when she pressed above. Elowen moved higher, toward the back of the knee, and pressed again. Nora pulled her leg back. Elowen said very calmly, Mrs. Bellamy, did the doctor remove her stocking when he examined her the first time? Ruth, standing in the doorway, said he examined the wound. Cut on her shin. Did he remove the stocking first or cut around it? Elowen said. Ruth said, slowly. He cut around it. He said it would disturb the wound lest to leave the stocking in place above. Elowen reached into the bag and took out a small pair of scissors. She looked at Nora. Can I take your stocking off, honey? Just the left one. Nora said yes. Everett was watching Pembroke, who had come into the doorway of the small room and was watching Elowen with an expression that had gone from cold authority to something else, something he was keeping very controlled. The expression of a man who has a feeling he is not going to like what happens next and is already preparing his position. Elowen rolled the stocking down slowly, carefully from the knee. About 4 inches above the ankle, on the inner side of the leg, where the calf muscle rounded, there was a second wound, smaller than the first, easy to miss if you were looking at the obvious injury and not looking past it. It was red at the edges and swollen, and the swelling had spread in the particular way that infection spreads when it's been given several days of uninterrupted time. The room was very quiet. There's a second puncture, Elowen said. She did not say it loudly. She did not look at Pembroke when she said it. She said it to Ruth Bellamy, in the tone of someone delivering information that is necessary, regardless of how it lands. It's infected. That's likely what's driving the fever. Ruth Bellamy made a sound that was not a word. Pembroke said, that wound was not present when I examined her. Elowen said nothing. The stocking concealed it, Pembroke said. That is not a failure of examination. That is a presentation problem. All right, Elowen said. She was still not looking at him. You cannot attribute the progression of this case to Dr. Pembroke, Elowen said, and now she looked up at him, and Everett saw her eyes, which were not angry and were not satisfied and were not any of the things he might have expected. They were simply clear. I'm going to clean this wound and treat the infection. You're welcome to stay and tell me if I do anything wrong. It was the most devastating thing she could have said, and it landed exactly the way it was meant to, and Pembroke knew it, and everyone in that room knew it. And Elowen turned back to Nora and said, this is going to sting. I'm going to be as quick as I can. Squeeze my hand if it hurts. Nora squeezed her hand before she'd even started, which made Elowen say, okay, fair enough. Everett went out to the main room. He sat down across from Tom Bellamy, who had come away from the table and was standing at the window looking at the yard. Neither man spoke. The sounds from the back room were quiet Elowen's voice, low and steady, talking Nora through each step, the occasional soft instruction to Ruth. No drama. No performance. Just work. Tom Bellamy said, without turning from the window, she came on her own. Yes, Everett said, nobody sent for her. No. Tom was quiet. She knew we'd hear about it, he said, and she came anyway. Everett didn't answer, because it didn't need one. One of the town women had drifted away into the kitchen and came back with coffee that nobody had asked for, but everyone accepted. The afternoon light shifted. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. The fire in the main room ticked and settled. After 40 minutes, Elowen came out of the back room. She looked tired in the functional way of someone who has been concentrating hard, not in the broken way of someone who has faced something beyond them. She set the supply bag on the table and began reorganizing it. The wound is clean, she said. I've packed it with a poultice to draw the rest of the infection. Fever should start breaking within a day, maybe 2. She needs to drink as much water as she'll take, and she needs to stay warm, and that leg needs to stay elevated. She looked at Ruth. The fever's not lower by tomorrow evening. Come get me. Ruth said, come get you. like she was repeating something in a foreign language, trying to be sure she'd heard correctly. At the ranch, Elowen said, yes. Ruth sat down in the chair she'd probably been sitting in for 3 days, all at once, the way people sit when something has been released that they didn't realize they were holding. She put her hands over her face for just a moment, not crying, just covering, and then she took them down and said, thank you. And the 2 words took up all the space in the room. Pembroke had not come out of the back room. Everett was paying attention to this. He was aware that there were 2 possible versions of what happened next. The version where Pembroke came out and said nothing and let the thing settle, and the version where he didn't. Pembroke came out of the back room. He looked at Elowen. He said, I would have found it. She was closing the bag. She didn't look up. Okay, she said. The stocking. I heard you, she said. Okay, I'm telling you. Dr. Pembroke. She looked up then, and her voice was still level, still that same clear, uninflected tone that was more effective than anger, because anger would have let him position himself as the aggrieved party. Level gave him nowhere to stand. I found a wound you missed. I treated it. If the fever breaks, that's what matters. I'm not going to argue with you about how it happened. You have no right to come into my patient's case without. Her mother invited me in, Elowen said. Her mother is not. Her mother is her mother, Elowen said. That counts. The 3 town women were watching this with the focused attention of people at a very important event that they would be describing for years. Tom Bellamy had turned from the window. Ruth Bellamy had not moved from her chair, but her back had straightened. Pembroke looked at Everett as though expecting him to contribute something to his position. Everett said, Is there something you need from me, doctor? Pembroke looked at him for a moment. You're the one who brought her here, he said. She knew the way, Everett said. She didn't need bringing. The silence after that was the kind that closes a conversation. Pembroke picked up his bag from the corner where he'd left it. He looked at Elowen one more time, and what was in his face was complicated in the way that things are complicated when a man who has been certain for 6 years is suddenly less certain and doesn't know what to do with that, because everything since then has been built on the certainty. He said, and Everett would remember this because of how much it clearly cost him, the poultice. What's the base compound? Elowen looked at him. She had not expected this. The surprise was brief, a fraction of a second, and then she answered simply and completely the way she would have answered a colleague. And she was precise about it, not leaving anything out, not punishing him for having to ask. Pembroke listened. He asked one clarifying question. She answered it. He nodded once and left the house. The room breathed again. Tom Bellamy crossed the room, and he extended his hand to Elowen, and she shook it. And he held on a moment longer than a handshake requires, and said, I don't know how to, and stopped. He tried again. If Noran stopped again. She's going to be all right, Elowen said. Go sit with her. He went. Everett carried the supply bag out to the horses. The afternoon was getting on, the light going orange at the edges, and the ride back was going to be cold. Elowen came out, and he held the mare while she mounted, and when she was up, she looked down at him for a moment. You almost used the badge, she said. I almost did, he said. Why didn't you? You told me not to, he said. Before that, in your head. You'd already decided, and then you stopped. She gathered the reins. Why? He thought about it. Because it was your call to make, he said. Not mine. She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was not the calculation he'd learned to recognize, not the measurement, not the stone-gray assessment, something older than those things, and less defended. Mount up, she said. It's getting cold. They rode out of the Bellamy yard in the orange afternoon and headed north on the road, back toward the mountains. Everett rode beside her, not behind, and the road was wide enough for that. After a while, she said, he asked about the poultice. I heard. That surprised me, she said. It surprised him too, Everett said. You could tell. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know what to do with that, she said. I've been angry at him for 6 years. Angry is simpler. Angry is usually simpler, Everett said. What do you do when it isn't enough anymore, she said. He thought about a banker in Billings and a farm that went to debt and 12 years of carrying something that had nowhere to go. You find something to replace it with, he said. Something that's actually useful. She looked at the road ahead. That sounds like experience talking, she said. It's not wisdom, he said. I'm still working on it. She laughed, a real laugh. Not the almost law he'd been cataloging for 3 weeks, but the actual thing, brief and unguarded, and it changed her face completely, the way a lamp changes a room. She seemed to realize it had happened and looked away, and he looked at the road, and they rode on. By the time they reached the ranch, the stars were out. Beatrice appeared in the doorway when she heard the horses and looked at their faces and said, "The girl? She'll be all right," Elowen said. Beatrice said, "Come eat. Both of you. There's stew." They put the horses up together, working in the barn by lamplight in the accustomed way they'd developed without designing it. Everett checked Copper's leg, still sound, still solid, and rubbed him down. And Elowen tended to the mare, and after a while she said, "From the next stall over, one of the women from town. One of the 3 who were there. Her name is Adeline Rourke. She has a son with a lung complaint that's been going on since summer. She asked me, when you were outside, if I could look at him. What did you say?" Everett said. "I said she could bring him to the ranch," Elowen said. "Next week, if the weather holds." He absorbed that. "That's the second person this week." "It is," she said. He came around to the front of the stall. She was brushing the mare and not looking at him. "Building something that doesn't need their permission," he said. She looked up then. "One at a time," she said. He nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for coming. For not," she paused, "for not making it about you." "It wasn't about me," he said. "Men have a way of making things about them even when they don't intend to," she said. "You didn't," I noticed. He picked up the brush from the shelf and went back to Copper's stall, because he did not know what to do with what she'd said, and he needed something practical to do with his hands. He brushed the horse for longer than was strictly necessary, and thought about her laughing on the road, and the way she had sat beside Nora's cot and said, "Hey, sweetheart," like she had said it 100 times, and what Beatrice had told him about trust being slower than telling. He was thinking about a lot of things he had not budgeted for and could not quite put away. Inside, Beatrice served stew and bread and asked every question she'd been saving while they were gone, and Elowen answered them one by one. And somewhere in the middle of it, she reached across the table for the bread, and her hand passed close to his, and she didn't move it quickly away, just left it there a half-second longer than necessary, and neither of them mentioned it. Later, sitting on the porch after Beatrice had gone to bed, Elowen said, "Nora's going to be fine." "Yes," he said. "I've been telling myself that since we left," she said. "I keep telling it to myself to make sure it stays true." "Stay true," he said. She pulled her coat tighter. The temperature was dropping. "Copper's almost sound," she said. "Almost," he said. "Another week. Maybe less." He looked at the mountains, dark against the darker sky. "Elowen," he said. She looked at him. "I'll leave when he's better," he said. He said it the way he'd been saying it, the ritual of it, the daily reminder that had started to feel, somewhere along the way, less like a plan and more like a question. She looked at him for a long moment. The porch light caught the side of her face, and her eyes were that complicated gray, not flat, not closed, just steady and very awake. "Then I hope he heals very slowly," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it in the barn, lightly, like a joke. But she held his gaze when she said it, and neither of them looked away. And the night was cold and very clear, and somewhere above the ridge a nighthawk called once and went quiet. And what was between them sat there in the dark, unnamed and patient, waiting for one of them to be brave enough to say what it actually was. Nora Bellamy's fever broke the next morning. Ruth came herself to bring the news, riding up the ranch road before breakfast with her hair not yet pinned and her coat buttoned wrong, the way people look when they've received news so good they left the house before finishing getting dressed. Elowen was in the barn when the wagon came, and she heard the hooves and came out, and Ruth climbed down from the wagon seat and said, "It broke in the night. She's asking for biscuits." And her voice cracked on the last word in the specific way that voices crack when the fear has finally been given permission to leave. Elowen put her hand on Ruth's arm. That was all. She didn't say anything, and Ruth didn't need her to, and they stood there in the cold morning air for a moment that required no words to be complete. Everett watched from the porch with his coffee. He watched Elowen's back, the particular set of her shoulders when she heard the news, not relief exactly, because she had believed it would work, but something more like confirmation. The difference between hoping you're right and finding out you were. Ruth came in for coffee, and Beatrice fed her, and she talked for an hour about the night. About Nora waking around 2 in the morning, soaked through and clear-eyed, and asking where her mother was. About Tom sitting in the chair beside the cot, having fallen asleep, holding the girl's hand. About the way the room had smelled different by morning. Less close, less wrong. She talked the way people talk when something terrible has reversed itself, and the story of it needs to be told to make it real. Before she left, she said to Elowen, "Adeline Rourke is going to come. With her boy." "She told me to tell you," Elowen said. "I know. She can come Wednesday if the road's clear." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "People are going to come," she said. "More than you're expecting, maybe. After what you did for Nora, I did what needed doing," Elowen said. "That's why they're going to come," Ruth said. She gathered her coat and nodded to Everett and went out to her wagon, and the sound of it going back down the road carried in the cold air long after it had disappeared from sight. The Wednesday visit from Adeline Rourke and her son lasted 3 hours. The boy's name was Martin. He was 9 years old, and the lung complaint had started in August after he'd spent 3 days in wet clothes during the early harvest. He wheezed when he breathed, a dry sound at the bottom of each inhale, and he had the patient, resigned quality of a child who has been sick long enough to have stopped expecting to feel different. Elowen listened to his chest with an instrument she'd made herself from a wooden tube and a piece of stretched membrane, a thing she'd built after reading a description in one of the medical volumes she'd collected over the years. It worked well enough. She listened for a long time, asked the boy to breathe deep and then slow, pressed along his ribs, checked his throat. Martin sat on the barn workbench and answered her questions with the seriousness of someone trying to be helpful, even though he was tired of being the subject of examination. Everett stayed out of the barn. He found things to do in the yard. He had learned by now the difference between being available and being in the way. When Adeline and Martin left, Elowen came and found him fixing a loose board on the well housing. She sat on the edge of the stone well casing and watched him work. "Bronchial inflammation," she said. "Not infection. Different treatment." "Will he be all right?" Everett said. "If his mother does what I told her. Steam twice a day, specific tea, keep him out of cold air for another month." She paused. If Pembroke had caught it in August, it would have resolved in 2 weeks. Now it'll take most of the winter. Everett drove the nail. Pembroke treated him in August. He saw him twice, she said. Prescribed something for general illness. Her voice was flat. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't right either. He understood the distinction. "You're angry," he said. "I'm tired of it," she said. "There's a difference. Angry takes energy. This is just..." She stopped. "This is just what it is. A 9-year-old boy who should have been better 2 months ago." Everett set down the hammer. "You can't fix every case he mishandled," he said. "Not in a winter." "I know that," she said. "Do you?" She looked at him. It was the kind of look that precedes an argument, and then she seemed to decide against it, which surprised him because she was not a woman who usually backed down from a challenge. "Beatrice says the same thing," she said. "Beatrice is a wise woman," he said. "She's an opinionated woman," Elowen said. "That's different." "Sometimes they're the same thing," he said, and she made the almost law sound, and he picked up the hammer and went back to work, and she sat on the well casing a while longer, not talking, just being there, which was something she'd been doing more often in the last few days. Being there without a reason beyond being there, he had noticed. He was trying not to make more of it than it was. He was failing at this somewhat. 2 days after the Rourke visit, a man named Garrett Finch arrived with a ranch hand whose arm had been badly cut by a hay rake. The hand's name was Dovo. He was 23, and he had the look of someone who had been told that arm injuries were usually fine, right up until the moment they weren't. The wound was 4 inches long across the forearm, clean-edged but deep, and it had been bound with a rag that was not clean. Elowen unwound the rag without commenting on it, which Everett thought showed considerable restraint. She cleaned the wound at the workbench with Dovo hissing through his teeth, stitched it with the small, neat stitches he'd seen her use on animals, packed and bandaged it, and gave Finch instructions that were clear enough that Everett could have followed them. Finch paid her. He did not ask the price. He put money on the workbench that was probably more than she would have asked for, and he did not make a speech about it, and Elowen did not refuse it. And that transaction was one of the more dignified things Everett had seen in some time. After they left, Elowen counted the money and added it to the tin she kept on the high shelf in the treatment room. Everett, who happened to be in the barn, saw her do it and saw the way she stood for a moment looking at the tin before she put it back, and understood that it was not about the money exactly, but about what the money represented, which was that something she had built was holding weight. On the 24th day since Everett had arrived at the Mercer Ranch, Copper moved around the paddock at a full walk without any trace of a limp. Elowen came out and watched. She leaned on the paddock fence beside Everett, and they watched the horse make a complete circuit, smooth and even, and she said, "How does he feel to you?" "Any unevenness?" "None," Everett said. "He needs another week before you ride him at pace," she said. "The tendon's repaired, but it's not fully strong. Hard ground at speed too soon sets them back further than the original injury." "A week," he said. "At least," she said. They stood at the fence. Copper came to Everett and pushed his head against his chest, the old familiar weight of him, and Everett's scratched behind his ears the way the horse liked, and felt the animal's breath warm on his coat. "You should write to your deputy," Elowen said. "Let him know your timeline." "I wrote 3 days ago," Everett said. She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "That the horse needed another 2 weeks," Everett said. She was quiet for a moment. Copper had turned his attention to the fence post and was investigating it with his lips in the methodical way horses investigate things that might conceivably be edible. "That's not quite what I said," Elowen said. "I said a week." "I know what you said," Everett said. She didn't answer that. She looked at Copper, and then at the mountains, and then at her hands on the fence rail. Her knuckles were dry from the cold and the work, the skin slightly rough at the joints, and there was a faint callus line across her palm from the fence tools she used. Working hands, real hands. He had been noticing things like this for a week, in a way that made him vaguely uncomfortable about himself. "Everett," she said. He looked at her. She opened her mouth and closed it. Tried again. "You're going to have to go," she said. "At some point." "I know that," he said. "Holt can't manage the territory alone indefinitely." "Holt is capable," Everett said. "He's managed before." "It's not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm not arguing about Holt." "What are you arguing about?" he said. She turned from the fence and looked at him straight on, the full weight of those gray eyes, and said, "You're making it harder." "Making what harder?" he said, though he knew. "You know what," she said. "Don't make me say it plainly if you already know." He did know. He had known for a while. He had also known that Elowen Mercer was not a woman who did anything except plainly, and that whatever she was protecting right now was something she hadn't decided what to do with yet, and that pressing her before she was ready would accomplish nothing except closing a door. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "I know what I'm making harder," he said. "I'm not trying to." "Yes, you are," she said, without heat. "You're trying a little. You know what you're doing when you fix things and stay close and bring me coffee when I'm in the treatment room. You know exactly what you're doing." He thought about denying it. He decided against it. "Yes," he said, "I do." She turned back to the fence. Copper had abandoned the post and was grazing at the far end of the paddock. "I have built something here," she said. "It's small. It's fragile still. I don't need a distraction." "I'm not trying to distract you," he said. "What are you trying to do?" she said. He had not let himself put it into words, deliberately, because putting it into words made it a thing you had to either act on or retreat from, and he had not been certain which he was capable of. But she had asked plainly, so he answered plainly. "I'm trying to figure out if this place is what I think it is," he said. "What do you think it is?" she said. "The first place I've been in 12 years that feels like somewhere," he said. The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. Elowen straightened up from the fence. She did not look at him. "You should think about that carefully," she said. "Before you decide it's the place and not the situation. Situations can feel like places." "I know the difference," he said. "Do you?" she said. And it was what he'd said to her about Martin Rourke. The same challenge returned, and it landed the same way, not unkind, just honest. He said, "I'm not certain, but I'm not wrong." She nodded slowly like she was filing that away. Then she said, "A week." and pushed off from the fence and went back toward the barn. And he watched her go, and Copper raised his head from the grass and looked at Everett with the mild incuriosity of a horse that has no opinions about human complications. Don't, Everett told him. Copper went back to grazing. That evening, 3 things happened that Everett would later understand as connected, though they didn't seem connected at the time. First, Beatrice told him, over dinner, that the bunkhouse on the north side of the property had been empty for 4 years and was structurally sound, but needed a thorough cleanup and probably some roof work. She said this in the context of a longer conversation about the ranch's general state, and she said it casually, but she looked at him while she said it. Second, Elowen mentioned that Adeline Rourke had spoken to her neighbor, who had spoken to someone else, and that there was a family 2 valleys over with a child who had been injured in a wagon accident and was not healing properly, and that they were asking if she could come look. That's 20 miles, Everett said. I know how far it is, she said. You'd go alone? I've ridden 20 miles alone before, she said. Not on a medical call, he said. She looked at him. Are you offering? She said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite teasing but was in that direction. I'm pointing out a practical consideration, he said. He's a marshal, Beatrice said, to no one in particular. Practical considerations are his specialty. Third, after Beatrice had gone to bed, and Elowen was banking the fire for the night, she said, without turning around, the bunkhouse. She told you about it. She mentioned it, he said. Elowen was quiet for a moment, working the fire poker. It would need 3 or 4 days of work, she said. Minimum. I'd say 4, he said. She did not say anything else. She put the poker back and went to bed, and Everett sat alone with the low fire and understood that 3 or 4 days of work was not nothing and had not been offered as nothing. He started on the bunkhouse the next morning. It was worse than Beatrice had suggested and better than he'd feared. The roof had 2 soft spots, but the underlying structure was dry. The walls were solid. The floor had buckled in one corner where water had gotten in at some point and dried badly, and that board section needed replacing, which meant a trip to the lumber yard in Red Hollow. He went on his own, which was the first time he'd been back in Red Hollow since bringing Elowen to the Bellamy farm. The town was not the same as it had been before, though nothing visible had changed. What had changed was the way people looked at him, or more precisely, the way people tried not to look like they were looking at him. He was the marshal who had been at the Bellamy farm when Elowen Mercer found the wound Pembroke missed, and Red Hollow had spent 10 days digesting that particular piece of information, and it had not gone down smoothly. He bought the lumber. He was at the yard loading it when he heard his name. Pembroke. The physician was crossing the street toward the yard with the deliberate step of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it before they've fully thought it through. Everett set down the board he was carrying and waited. Marshal, Pembroke said. Doctor, Everett said. Brooke stopped a few feet away. He looked like he had slept badly, which was a change from his usual appearance of a man who has always slept exactly as long as necessary and wakes refreshed. I understand you've been at the Mercer Ranch for some weeks, he said. My horse was injured, Everett said. Miss Mercer treated him. The mountain road was impassable. Of course, Pembroke said, and there was something in his tone that stopped short of insinuation, but stood close to it. Everett looked at him. Pembroke seemed to reconsider the tone. I wanted to say, he began, and then started again. Bellamy girl, the compound Miss Mercer used. Yes, Everett said. It's not in any pharmacopoeia I have, Pembroke said. I've been trying to identify the binding agent. He said this with the particular difficulty of a man who is asking a question by not quite asking it. You could ask her, Everett said. I'm asking you, Pembroke said. Everett picked up the board. I'm a marshal, he said. I don't know medicine. Pembroke was quiet for a moment. She would not speak with me, he said. She spoke with you at the Bellamy farm, Everett said. That was different. Was it, Everett said. It was not a question. He loaded the board and picked up another. Pembroke said, I made an error. In the Bellamy case. The stalking, you don't need to explain it to me, Everett said. I'm not explaining it to you, Pembroke said, with a flash of the old authority, and then it subsided. He stopped. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. And it sounded like the most honest thing he'd said in a long time, possibly to himself as much as to Everett. Everett set the last board in the wagon. He looked at Pembroke. He thought about 6 years of a lie so smoothly told that it had become the truth in a small town, and about a woman who had come back anyway and built something from nothing, and about the question of whether a man who had done a wrong thing could do anything about it that wasn't too late. He said, "You know where the ranch is?" Pembroke said nothing. "That's all I've got for you," Everett said. He climbed up to the wagon seat. "Good day, Doctor." He drove back to the ranch and told Elowen about it that evening. He told it simply, without interpretation, and let her hear it and decide what to do with it. She listened with her hands flat on the kitchen table, and her face doing the controlled work of processing something complicated. "He won't come," she said. "Probably not," Everett said. "And if he does, then you decide what to do with that when it happens," Everett said. "Not before." She looked at him. "You're less complicated than I thought you were," she said. "When you first got here." "I'm not less complicated," he said. "I'm just different complicated." "That's true," she said, and something softened at the edges of it. The way things soften when two people have been honest with each other long enough that the honesty has become a kind of comfort. The bunkhouse took 5 days, not 4. On the second day, the south wall revealed a rat's nest inside the insulation that required 2 additional hours of work. On the third day, the replacement floorboards turned out to be a 1/4 inch too wide and had to be planed down, which Everett did by hand, slowly, with a tool he found in the back of the barn that was old but still sharp. On the 4th day, he rehung the door and found that the frame had shifted and the door dragged, and he had to reset the frame, which meant the whole day was the door. On the 5th day, he finished. He stood back and looked at the bunkhouse, which was clean and tight and warm and smelled of new wood and fresh air instead of 4 years of closed-up nothing, and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a finished thing. Elowen came and looked. She walked in, looked at the walls, the floor, the roof from the inside, the door, the repaired window frame. She said nothing for a moment. "What were you thinking?" she said. "For it," he said. "That's not for me to decide." She looked at him. "You could make it a treatment room," he said. "More space than the barn corner. Proper light on the east side. A place for people to wait that's not inside the barn." She stood in the center of the bunkhouse for a long moment, turning slowly, looking at everything. He could see her building it in her mind, the same way she organized the supply shelves, the same way she had organized the treatment corner methodically, efficiently, without waste. "That's a good idea," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That was modest," she said. "Was it?" he said. She laughed. The real one again, and it was easier this time than it had been on the road after the Bellamy farm, less startled by itself. She shook her head and went out, and he followed. And outside the air was cold and dry, and the sky was the hard blue of late October, and the mountains were clear. Copper had been fully sound for 3 days. Everett had stopped mentioning this. Elowen had stopped mentioning it. Beatrice had not mentioned it once, which told him that Beatrice was being deliberate about not mentioning it, which told him that Beatrice understood something about the current situation. On the 29th day, he saddled Copper. He did not do it secretly. He did it in the morning, after breakfast, in the paddock, while Elowen was in the barn. He worked slowly, checking each buckle, running his hand along the horse's back before the saddle went on, talking into him. The horse stood patiently, which was a good sign. Elowen came out and watched. He mounted. He rode Copper in a careful circle around the paddock, watching the gait, feeling for any unevenness. There was none. The horse moved clean and sure and comfortable, and Everett could feel it the difference from the careful tentative movement of 3 weeks ago. This was Copper as he was supposed to be. He rode back to where Elowen stood at the fence. She had her arms crossed, not against him, just against the cold, but her face was doing the controlled work again, and he could see what it was costing her to keep it there. "Sound," he said. "Yes," she said. He dismounted. "I need to go," he said. "Not today, but soon, in the next few days," she nodded. "I know," she said. "There are things I need to handle," he said. "Holt, my cases, reports that are 6 weeks overdue." "I understand," she said. And then he said, "I'm going to come back." She went very still. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "I'm not leaving and hoping. I'm leaving and coming back. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding something, working through the familiar calculation, except that this time when it finished she didn't look away, and she didn't close the expression. And what was there instead was something more open than anything he'd seen from her, which was both more and less than he'd expected. "On what basis?" she said, carefully. "When you come back." "On what basis?" "Whatever basis you'll give me," he said. "That's a coward's answer," she said. "I know what I want." "I need to know what you want," he said. "I want to come back to this ranch and this woman and whatever we build from here. That's what I want." The morning was cold and clear and very quiet. Elowen said, "That's direct." "You ask for direct," he said. She looked at Copper, and then at the mountains, and then at him. "Come back in the spring," she said. "Give me the winter. Let me build what I'm building without—" She paused. "Without that other thing in the room while I'm trying to think clearly." "The spring," he said. "And don't write long letters," she said. "Write short ones, practical ones, where you are, what you're doing. I don't need—" She stopped again. "I just don't need long letters." "Short letters," he said. "Practical." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "One more thing," he said. "When I come back, I'm coming back to the man, not the marshal. I want you to know that the badge comes with me because it's my work. But it's not why I'm coming." Something moved across her face. She pressed her lips together, and for a moment he thought she was going to say something that was going to change everything, and then she said, "Okay, just okay." Simple and direct and completely hers. He nodded. He turned Copper back toward the barn to unsaddle him, because today was not the day, and there were 2 or 3 things left to do on the property that were bothering him. And Beatrice needed a cord of firewood split before winter deepened, and he had time. He had time, and that was not nothing. He had 3 days, and in those 3 days he split the wood and fixed the last thing on the south fence, and taught himself where everything in the barn was so that he would know it when he came back, the way you learn a place you intend to return to rather than a place you are leaving. On the 3rd morning he packed his saddlebags. Beatrice made breakfast and talked enough for everyone and did not cry, though he had the sense she was capable of it and was choosing not to on his behalf. He thanked her with more genuine warmth than he'd expected to feel, because she had been kind to him in the particular way of people who are kind because they want to and not because they have to, which is the only kind of kindness that means anything. Elowen walked with him to the gate. He mounted Copper and looked down at her. She was wearing her heavy coat, and her hair was up against the cold. And she looked like the ranch, like something that had been tested by weather and kept standing. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she said. He turned Copper toward the road. He rode through the gate. He went 20 yards, and then 40, and then the road bent, and he knew that if he went around the bend he would be out of sight of the ranch, and he stopped. He sat on the horse in the cold morning for a moment. Then he turned around. Elowen was still at the gate, still there, still watching, arms crossed against the cold, not having moved. And that was an answer to a question he hadn't quite asked. He rode back. He stopped at the gate. He reached into his coat and unpinned the badge, and held it in his hand for a moment, looking at it, and then he looked at Elowen. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not as a marshal, just as the man. Answer the man." She looked up at him. "Do you want me to go?" he said. She said very quietly, "I never wanted you to leave." He pinned the badge back on. He dismounted. The gate was still between them. He put his hand on it, and she put her hand on it from the other side, and they stood there for a moment with the gate between them, which was in some ways the whole story of the last month, something separating them that was becoming a formality rather than a fact. He opened the gate and came through, and Copper followed him in, because Copper was a horse that knew when he was home. Beatrice saw it first. She was at the kitchen window when Everett came back through the gate, and she watched him dismount and lead Copper into the paddock and say something to Elowen that Beatrice couldn't hear, and she watched Elowen's face while he said it, and then she turned from the window and sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the wood surface and said quietly, to nobody, "Well, finally." Then she got up and put more water on for coffee, because some moments require something practical to do with your hands, and this was one of them. Outside, Elowen and Everett stood in the paddock with Copper between them like an accidental buffer, and neither of them was saying anything, which was fine, because what had just been said was enough for one morning. Copper investigated Everett's coat pocket with the optimism of a horse that has learned that coat pockets sometimes contain oats, and Everett let him look, and Elowen watched the horse with the expression she used when she was not ready to look at the thing she actually wanted to look at. "You came back through the gate," she said. "I did," he said. "What does that mean?" she said, practically. "In terms of what does that actually mean for your work?" "It means I'm not leaving today," he said. "After that, we figure it out." She looked at him then. "That's not a plan," she said. "No," he said. "It's a start." She seemed to want to argue with this, and then decided against it. She took a breath instead. The cold morning air came out of her in a small cloud, and she looked at the mountains for a moment. And then she said, "Come inside," before Beatrice drives herself insane, pretending she isn't watching. From the kitchen window, Beatrice stepped quickly back to the stove. What followed was not a fairy tale morning. It was awkward in the specific way of two people who have said something true and now have to live in the same space as the truth, which is harder than saying the thing. Everett sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Beatrice put in front of him and was too aware of where Elowen was in the room. Elowen moved around, doing the morning tasks she always did, and was too careful about not being too aware of him. Beatrice talked more than usual, which was considerable, about the weather and the state of the wood supply, and whether the gray mare's shoe needed attention, and did not once reference what had just happened, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. By noon, they had settled back into something resembling the ordinary rhythm of the ranch. Everett went to check on a drainage problem near the north pasture that had been on his mind for days. Elowen was in the treatment room, which was still the bunkhouse in its early stages of conversion, but already beginning to look like what it was going to become. She had moved her supply shelves in with Everett's help the previous afternoon, and she was now reorganizing them in the configuration she'd been planning in her head for 3 weeks. He looked in on his way back from the pasture. She had her back to the door and was sorting herb packets with the concentration she brought to everything, placing each one with the precision of someone who would need to find it fast and in the dark if she had to. "The drainage near the north pasture needs a channel cut," he said, "about 40 feet. Before the spring thaw or that corner of the field is going to be a swamp." She didn't look up. "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to do that for 2 years." "I'll do it before the ground freezes," he said. She stopped sorting. Set the packet in her hand down carefully. She turned around. "Everett," she said. He waited. "I need you to understand something," she said. "About this, whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at the space between them, which was as close as Elowen Mercer got to discussing feelings directly. I'm not going to change what I'm building here. I'm not going to make it smaller to make room. This isn't..." She stopped, started again. "I've spent 6 years building something that belongs to me and doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. I'm not giving that up." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I know you're not asking," she said, "but things happen. People's plans change other people's plans without meaning to." She looked at him steadily. "I need to know you understand that I come with this." She gestured at the room, the shelves, the supplies. "All of this comes with me. It's not separate." He looked at the room. The ordered shelves, the clean workbench, the medical volume open on the corner table to a page she'd been cross-referencing. The thing she'd built from nothing in a barn corner and was now building into something that would outlast the barn corner. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her. "Elowen," he said, "that's the part I came back for." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed the way a landscape changes when the cloud cover breaks and the actual light gets through. Not a dramatic change, just a real one. "Okay," she said, quiet and direct and completely hers, the same way she'd said it at the gate. "Okay," he said. She turned back to the shelves. He went to deal with the drainage problem, and the day went on, and it was not perfect or easy or resolved in any clean sense, but it was real, which was better. He wrote to Holt that afternoon, not a short letter, and not a long one the right length, which was enough to explain and not enough to over-explain. He told Holt he was staying at the Mercer Ranch through winter on a personal matter, and that the Bitterglass Valley had been without proper law presence for longer than was comfortable, and that Holt should forward anything urgent but handle what he could. He told Holt he would return to full duty in the spring and would restructure his patrol routes at that point to include the valley. He sealed it and gave it to the freighter, who came through 3 days later, and that was the administrative part handled. The personal part was less neat and took longer. November came in cold and hard, the way Montana Novembers do, without apology or transition. The ground froze in the second week, and Everett got the drainage channel cut in the north pasture just before it did. Working 2 full days with a pickaxe and a shovel, and coming in at night with his back in a state of serious complaint that he did not mention, because complaining about it would have been pointless. Elowen insisted. She said nothing about it, but the morning after the second day, there was a tin of liniment on the edge of the wash basin when he got up, with no explanation and no note. He used it and said nothing, and she said nothing, and that was its own kind of conversation. The treatment room in the bunkhouse was fully operational by the end of November's first week. Elowen had added a second lamp and a proper examination table, a door on sawhorses, essentially, but leveled and padded and exactly the right height, and had organized the supply shelves so that she could reach anything in 3 steps in any direction. She'd hung a small board outside the bunkhouse door that said, in her clean, spare handwriting, E. Mercer Animal and Medical Treatment Knock. Beatrice looked at the sign for a long moment the morning it went up. Should have happened 6 years ago, she said. It's happening now, Elowen said. Beatrice nodded. That's true, she said. Now is what we have. People came. Not in a flood, a steady trickle, 1 or 2 a week, which was enough to matter, and not so many that it broke the rhythm of the ranch. Adeline Rourke came back with Martin, whose breathing was measurably better, and stayed for coffee, and told Elowen about 2 other families she'd mentioned the ranch to. A farmer named Jessup came with a goat that had a leg caught in a trap. A woman named Clara Denby came alone on a Thursday morning and sat in the new treatment room for an hour. And Everett never knew exactly what was discussed, but he knew that Elowen gave her a packet of something from the high shelf and sat with her longer than the medical part required, and that Clara Denby's face when she left was different from the face she'd come in with. Everett did not ask about that one. Some things were between the healer and the person being healed, and he understood that. What he was learning that November and into December was that protecting Elowen did not mean what he had assumed it meant. He had spent 12 years as a marshal with a defined understanding of what protection looked like. It looked like a badge, a gun, a legal authority, positioned between a threat and the person being threatened. That was real, and he didn't stop believing in it. But what Elowen needed from him was something different, more textured, harder to name. She needed him to be present without being loud. She needed him to handle the parts of the ranch that took his kind of strength, the physical weight of a winter's work, the conversations in Red Hollow that went better with a badge on without making those contributions the center of anything. She needed him to understand that she was the point of this place, not him. He worked on that. He was not always good at it. There were days when his instinct to step in front of a problem was stronger than his judgment, and she would say something short and precise that told him he'd overstepped, and he would step back, and sometimes that was uncomfortable, and neither of them handled it perfectly. He said the wrong thing twice in November in ways he recognized as wrong about 30 seconds after saying them, and both times she told him clearly what the problem was, and both times he listened without defending himself, which was harder than it sounds for a man who had spent his career being right about things. The second time, after she'd told him what the problem was and he'd taken it in, he said, I'm going to keep doing that. Not on purpose, but it's in the way I was built. She said, I know. I'm going to try not to, he said. I know that too, she said. I'm going to keep telling you when you do it. That's fair, he said. Yes, she said, it is. They were getting better at it. Not smooth better, which is the real version of better, the kind that has the roughness of actual work on it. The letter from Holt came in early December. It was mostly routine case updates, a matter in the eastern part of the territory that had resolved on its own, a question about jurisdiction on a land dispute that Everett answered in 2 sentences. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, Holt wrote, "Word's gotten around you're wintering at the Mercer Ranch. People are saying the woman there helped the Bellamy girl when Pembroke couldn't. Don't know if that matters to you, but figured you'd want to know it's being said. Everett read it twice and gave it to Elowen without comment. She read it once. She folded it and gave it back. She went to the treatment room, and he heard her working in there for a while, and when she came out for dinner she seemed quieter than usual, in the way of someone processing something that is good and complicated at the same time. "It's not the same as an apology," she said at dinner. "No," Everett agreed. "People talking is not the same as the thing being made right," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. But it's not nothing," Beatrice said from her end of the table. Elowen looked at her aunt. "It's not nothing," she agreed quietly. "Just not everything." "Nothing ever is," Beatrice said. "You take what's real and you work with it." Elowen looked at her plate. Something moved in her face that she didn't try to control. Just let go through. And it was not happiness exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying something for so long that even a partial setting down of it is felt in the bones. She took what was real. She worked with it. December brought 2 feet of snow and then a brief thaw and then another foot, and the ranch settled into the particular isolated rhythm of a Montana winter. The world contracted to what you could see and reach, and you found out quickly whether what you could see and reach was enough. For Everett, it was more than enough. He had not known before this that he was a man who had been living at the wrong scale. Too big a territory, too much movement, never in one place long enough to learn it. The Mercer Ranch in winter was the opposite of that. He knew every fence post. He knew where the water froze first and where it didn't. He knew the sound the barn door made when the temperature dropped below a certain point, a low creak at the top hinge, and he knew to check the animals when he heard it. He and Elowen moved through the winter days with an ease that had been earned through friction and was better for it. They argued about small things, the right way to bank a fire for the night, whether the gray mare needed her winter blanket before or after the first hard frost, whether a particular section of fencing could wait until spring or needed attention now. The arguments were not serious. They were the kind of arguments that people have when they've learned how to argue without doing damage, which is something most people spend years not learning. He asked her once. In January, sitting at the kitchen table while the wind drove snow against the windows, "Do you regret it? Staying in the valley?" After everything Pembroke did. She thought about it, which was what she did. She actually thought, rather than answering immediately from the ready-prepared position. "No," she said. "This is where my father's land is. This is where Beatrice is." And she paused. "I think I needed to stay. I needed to build something here specifically, not somewhere else. Not somewhere they couldn't see it. To prove it to them," he said. "No," she said. "To prove it to myself. They're almost beside the point." She looked at the window, the snow moving against the glass. "If I'd left, I would have always wondered if I left because I chose to or because I let them push me out. I needed to know the difference." He thought about that. About a 19-year-old in Billings, watching a bank take his father's farm and becoming a marshal, because at least it was something. About the difference between running toward a thing and running away from one. "That's the only question that matters," he said. "Did you choose it, or did they choose it for you?" "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." He poured more coffee for both of them, and the wind went on outside, and they sat in the warmth of the kitchen they'd both learned to move around in, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the specific abundance of a life that fits the person living it, which most people spend a long time looking for, and some never find. In February, the Pembroke thing happened, and Everett would not have predicted how it happened. A book arrived. Not brought in person, not with a letter, just left at the ranch gate on a Wednesday morning when no one saw who left it. A large medical volume, old, the binding worn at the spine, with Silas Pembroke's name written on the inside front cover in faded ink. Elowen found it when she went to open the gate for a morning visitor, and she brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time without touching it again. Beatrice came in and looked at it too. "Is there a note?" Beatrice said. "No," Elowen said. Beatrice sat down. "That took courage," she said, in its own insufficient way. "It's not an apology," Elowen said. "No," Beatrice said. "A man like that isn't built for apologies. This is what he has instead." Elowen picked up the book. She turned it in her hands. It was a surgical reference, detailed, thorough, the kind of volume that would have cost Pembroke a substantial amount when he'd bought it and had clearly been well used. She opened it and looked at a page, and then another. Everett watched from the doorway, where he'd come in from the barn and stopped, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. Elowen said, "To nobody in particular, there are 3 case studies in here I've been wanting to read for years." Carried the book to the treatment room and put it on the shelf, and that was how the Pembroke thing was handled, not resolved. Not forgiven. Not forgotten. But moved to a shelf where it could be useful instead of just heavy. That is not the tidy ending. It is the real one. The tidy ending requires that wrongs be righted completely, that the person who caused the damage say the right words and mean them fully, and that the damage be undone. Real life gives you a book without a note, left at a gate by a man who cannot quite manage more than that, and you put it on the shelf and use it, and decide that being useful is its own kind of justice. Elowen understood that before Everett did. He was still learning it, watching her. March came, and the snow began to thin on the south-facing slopes, and the particular restlessness of a Montana spring started working on everyone and everything, the animals, the fences, the list of things that had been waiting for the ground to thaw. Everett wrote to Holt about the new patrol arrangement he'd been planning since November. He would restructure his routes to put him through the Bitterglass Valley on a regular basis, which was defensible on law enforcement grounds because the valley had in fact been underserved. He would base himself at the Mercer Ranch when not on patrol, which was his personal business and nobody else's. Holt would carry more of the Central Territory management, which Holt was ready for. He wrote it as a plan, not a proposal, because it was not a proposal. He had thought it through carefully over winter, and he was not uncertain about it. Holt wrote back, figured something like this was coming. "I'll manage. Don't let whatever you've got up there make you sloppy in the field." Everett showed Elowen the letter. She read Holt's response and said, "He sounds like a sensible man." "He's a very good deputy," Everett said. "You should go see him," she said. "Before the spring work starts here, go do what you need to do in person and come back with it settled." He looked at her. "You want me to go?" "I want you to come back," she said. "That's different. Go settle it properly and come back settled." He rode out the first week of March. He was gone 11 days. He went to Holt, who was a compact, serious man in his late 30s, who shook Everett's hand and said very little that wasn't necessary and was clearly going to be fine. He went to the territorial office and filed 6 weeks of delayed reports and had a conversation with the regional supervisor that was less difficult than he'd expected, partly because his record was good, and partly because the supervisor was a practical man who understood that marshals in the field made arrangements that supervisors in offices did not always need to know the details of. He rode back to the Mercer Ranch on a cold, bright morning in mid-March. Elowen was outside when he came through the gate. Not because she was watching for him, she was examining a fence post with the frown of someone who has found something to be annoyed about, and she looked up when she heard the horse and then looked back at the fence post. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. He dismounted. "How's Holt?" she said. "Ready," he said. "He'll be fine." And the supervisor? "Handled," he said. She nodded. "There's a fence post on the south side that's worse than it looks from here," she said. "I'll look at it tomorrow," he said. "It could go in the next hard wind," she said. "Then I'll look at it this afternoon," he said. She nodded again, still looking at the fence. And then she said, without turning around, "I'm glad you're back." It was the most direct thing she had said to him that wasn't in response to a direct question. He stood with it for a moment because it deserved a moment. "Me too," he said. Spring came in fully by April, the way it comes in Montana, sudden and muddy, and a little overwhelming after the closed-in winter, the world opening back up all at once. The patients at the treatment room increased as the roads cleared. Elowen worked 6 days a week, and on the 7th she did ranch work, and there was no real day off, which was something she'd accepted so long ago that she'd stopped noticing it. Everett noticed. He didn't say anything about it, because she hadn't asked, but he paid attention to what she needed before she had to ask for it, and that was its own kind of saying. The cottonwood trees along the ranch's southern edge came into leaf in late April, and Beatrice decided, in the way that Beatrice decided things, that this was the appropriate moment for a conversation she'd been patient about for 5 months. She said, "At dinner on an April Thursday, I want to be at the wedding." Elowen put her fork down. Everett kept his face still. I'm not getting any younger, Beatrice said, pleasantly, and I'd like to be there. That's all I'm saying. Beatrice, Elowen said. I'm not rushing anything, Beatrice said. I'm simply noting that I have a preference about timing. For health reasons, she picked up her coffee. Also, I've already planned what I'll wear. Elowen looked at Everett. He looked back at her. There was, between them, a moment of the specific shared helplessness of two people being managed by a small, elderly woman with very good timing. We haven't discussed that, Elowen said to Beatrice. I know, Beatrice said. I'm giving you something to discuss. She finished her coffee and excused herself and went to bed and left them at the table. Elowen looked at her hands. She's not wrong that she's not getting younger, she said. No, Everett said. I'm not. Elowen stopped. I'm not opposed to the idea. Good, he said. Neither am I. She looked up at him. Is this how we're doing this? She said. Over dinner with Beatrice as the instigating party. She's efficient, he said. Elowen laughed. The real one. And shook her head and said, I'm not opposed to the idea in the spring. Under the cottonwoods, small. Just the people who actually matter. That's all I want, he said. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It happened in May. Not in a church. Neither of them had suggested a church, and neither would have. Under the cottonwoods on the south sides of the ranch, on a Saturday morning when the trees were fully leafed and the air smelled of wet grass and the mountains were clear. The people who came were the ones who mattered. Holt, who had ridden 2 days to be there and stood in the back and did not cry, or claimed he didn't. Ruth Bellamy and Tom, who came with Nora, who was fully recovered and stood with her boots in the grass, and watched the whole thing with the focused attention of a 12-year-old deciding what to make of grown-up behavior. Adeline Rourke and her son Martin, whose breathing had been clear since February. Garrett Finch. Clara Denby. The ranch families who had come to the treatment room over winter, drawn not by formal invitation but by word of mouth, the same way everything spread in the valley. Beatrice wore a blue dress she'd been keeping for a significant occasion and looked deeply satisfied with herself from start to finish. The words they said to each other were not long. Neither of them was built for long. Everett told her that he was a man who had spent 12 years going in the wrong direction toward what he was looking for, and that he intended to spend the rest of his time going toward her. Elowen said, and this was the part that Ruth Bellamy would tell people about for years, that she had built something here that didn't need anyone's permission, and that she was choosing him not because she needed him, but because she wanted him, and that she understood the difference, and that the difference was everything. Beatrice cried. She had said she wouldn't. She did anyway, briefly, and then straightened up and looked annoyed at herself. And Nora Bellamy handed her a handkerchief with the seriousness of a child who takes her responsibilities seriously. And Beatrice took it and said, Thank you, sweetheart. And that was one of the small, true moments that make up a day worth remembering. The summer that followed was not a quiet one. Everett's reorganized patrol schedule worked better than he'd expected, partly because he'd designed it with the valley at the center rather than as an afterthought, and partly because Holt turned out to be exactly as capable as Everett had told Elowen he was. He was gone some days, several days at a stretch during busier periods, and he came back from those stretches with the accumulated weight of his work on him, the specific tiredness of a man who has been dealing with things that don't resolve cleanly. And Elowen didn't ask him to set it down before he was ready to set it down. She let it be there until it wasn't, and that was its own kind of care. When he was home, he was fully home. That was the arrangement, unspoken, but understood. When he was in the field, she didn't wait for him in the sense of pausing her life. She worked. She built. The treatment room saw 15 patients in July alone, and she started keeping a record book, documenting each case in her clean, spare handwriting what she'd observed, what she'd treated, the outcomes. Not for anyone else, for herself. Because if you are building knowledge, you should be building it carefully. In September, Nora Bellamy came to the ranch on her own for the first time. She rode up on a small pony and knocked on the treatment room door and told Elowen that she wanted to learn. She said it plainly, the way 12-year-olds say things when they have made a firm decision. She wanted to learn what Elowen knew. She wanted to understand what the herbs were for and how to clean a wound properly, and what the difference was between a fracture and a sprain and how you could tell. Elowen looked at her for a moment. "Does your mother know you're here?" she said. "Yes," Nora said. She said to ask. Elowen looked at her for another moment. Then she opened the treatment room door wider. "Come in," she said. "Don't touch anything yet. Just watch." Nora came in, and she watched, and she came back the following week, and the week after that, and it was the beginning of something that neither of them could have named precisely, but that both of them understood was important. This is what Everett would think about later, when he had the distance to think about it clearly, that the most significant things rarely announce themselves. Storm in the mountains, a horse going down on a bad trail, a light in the dark. None of those things felt like the beginning of anything at the time. They felt like problems. They felt like complications, like obstacles, like the wrong things happening at the wrong moment. He had been trying to cross the mountains and get to where he was going. What he didn't understand was that he had not known where he was going. He had a direction forward, always forward. The marshal's instinct that motion was the same as purpose, but a direction is not a destination. And he had confused them for 12 years because he didn't have anything else to navigate by. Elowen understood something about this that he was still learning. She had been pushed off her path and made to look like the one who had fallen, and she had gone back to the place she knew and started from there. And she had built outward from the center rather than trying to return to someone else's idea of where she should be. That took a kind of patience and a kind of stubbornness that Everett had not recognized as strength when he'd first met her, because he'd been looking for the wrong kind of strength. He'd been looking for the kind that pushes through. She had the kind that builds in place. Both kinds are real. They are different tools. What he believed, by the time the second autumn came, was this, that the people who find their way to what they're supposed to be doing are rarely the ones who had a clear plan. They are usually the ones who got stuck somewhere by weather, by circumstance, by an injury they didn't plan for, and while they were stuck, they paid attention to what was actually in front of them, and discovered that it was worth staying for. You don't plan your way to the right life. You recognize it when you're standing in it. Copper was running the high pasture on an October afternoon, 2 years from the night he'd come down on that rocky trail when Everett came back from a 3-day patrol and found Elowen waiting at the corral fence, watching the horse. She didn't look like she was waiting for Everett. She looked like she was watching Copper, which she was. But she had known the sound of that particular horse's approach on that particular road for 2 years now, and she did not turn around when Everett rode in, which meant she'd already done the turning around in her head. He unsaddled and turned his horse out and came to stand beside her at the corral fence. They watched Copper move across the upper pasture, unhurried, fully sound, the horse that had started everything by having the poor judgment to step wrong on a wet rock. "He looks good," Everett said. "He always looks good," she said. "He knows it too. Vain animal. He's earned some vanity," Everett said. She leaned on the fence. He leaned beside her. The October sky was doing the thing it does in Montana when the light goes low, turning the whole valley a color that doesn't have a useful name, somewhere between gold and amber and the particular red of old brick. "Nora set 3 stitches today," Elowen said, "on her own. I only had to correct her once." "That's good," he said. "She's going to be better than me," Elowen said, and the way she said it was not modest, it was stated as a fact, with the satisfaction of someone who understands that being surpassed by your student is not a defeat. "Not for a long time," he said. "No," she said, "but eventually." Which is the point. He thought about that, about the things you build that outlast you, about the girl with steady hands and a serious face sitting in a treatment room learning how to see what's actually wrong, about a small sign on a bunkhouse door that said Knock and the people who knocked and what they received when they did. Elowen said, "Something wrong with that horse?" He looked at Copper, who was standing perfectly still at the far end of the pasture, doing nothing wrong at all. "Hard to say," he said. "Might need some observation." She said. "How long?" "Another few years at least," he said. She looked at him sideways, and he looked at her, and what was there between them in that October light was not a happy ending, because happy endings are for stories that are finished, and this one wasn't finished, not by a long way. What was there? Was something better than that? What was there was a life in progress, real, imperfect, full of winter drainage channels and difficult patience and patrol schedules that didn't always cooperate in arguments about fence posts, and a mean mule named Hector, who had never once warmed to Everett and clearly never would. What was there was the particular satisfaction of two people who had each built something true and had been smart enough and stubborn enough and eventually brave enough to build them in the same place. Everett had spent 12 years going somewhere. He was done going somewhere. He was here. He had ridden into this valley on a bad night with a lame horse and nowhere to be, and that was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to him. And he had spent 2 years being grateful for it in the daily, practical way of a man who shows his gratitude through drainage channels and split firewood and knowing when to step back and when to step forward and learning, slowly, to tell the difference. The horse was fine. The horse had been fine for a long time, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to pretend otherwise.